Ysera had always stood out at the prestigious Galactic Academy of Varelia. She was tall, with shimmering violet skin that reflected the light of the twin suns. Her species, the Orolithians, were known for their intelligence, speed, and natural beauty. Ysera was no different. She excelled in every subject, whether it was advanced physics, diplomacy, or combat simulations. But today, as she walked into the grand classroom, she couldn't help but notice something irritating. At the far side of the room, sitting alone in the corner, was Ethan, her human classmate. He had messy brown hair, a pair of old-fashioned glasses, and always seemed to wear the same casual outfit, unlike the highly advanced uniforms the rest of the students wore. The other students in the room often whispered about him. Humans were seen as primitive by most of the galaxy's species, and Ethan was no exception. He didn't have the genetic modifications that made most of his peers faster or stronger. He lacked the psychic abilities that many alien species possessed, and unlike the Orolithians, who had natural telepathy, Ethan communicated in the simplest way possible, through words. Why is he even here? Ysera had heard one of her classmates, Zarek, whisper one day. Humans are so ordinary. Ysera had been quick to agree with that. It wasn't that she disliked Ethan. No, it was more that she felt sorry for him. He was a reminder that the universe was full of species that couldn't measure up to the advanced beings who ruled the stars. He was the only human in their class, and Ysera couldn't help but mock him when the opportunity arose. After all, he was just a simple human from a planet far away, a place no one cared much about. What could he possibly bring to the table? That day, as the students settled into their seats, Ysera noticed Ethan once again sitting alone, his face buried in a book. He never seemed to participate in class discussions. It was as though he was always observing, never engaging with the rest of them. Ysera, annoyed by his silence, decided to speak up. "Hey, Ethan," she called out, her voice filled with playful mockery. "You might want to start paying attention. This lesson is a little above your human level." Ethan glanced up from his book, his eyes a soft shade of brown. He smiled slightly, as if he didn't mind her teasing. "I'm paying attention," he replied, his voice calm. "Just thinking." "Thinking?" Ysera scoffed. "What could you possibly be thinking? That you're going to somehow outsmart us?" Ethan didn't respond right away. Instead, he adjusted his glasses and turned his attention back to the lesson. Ysera expected him to cower or get defensive, but he didn't. His lack of reaction only made her more annoyed. "You know, humans are so strange," she muttered to herself. "No enhancements, no special abilities. Just boring." As the class continued, Ysera couldn't help but steal glances at Ethan. He was sitting there, completely at ease, while the rest of the students showed off their advanced talents. Even Zarek, who was known for his skills in battle simulations, couldn't seem to understand why Ethan was so relaxed. The teacher, a tall alien with translucent skin named Professor Vastar, began a difficult lesson on advanced tactical strategies. The Orolithians in the class immediately began to show off their skills, effortlessly solving complex equations and discussing strategies with ease. Ysera, of course, was one of the first to volunteer answers, impressing everyone with her quick thinking and sharp intellect. She glanced at Ethan again, expecting him to be struggling. But to her surprise, Ethan's hand shot up. "Ethan," Professor Vastar asked, surprised by the human's sudden participation. Ysera frowned. What could he possibly know about this? Ethan stood up slowly, his expression calm and focused. "The answer to your question is simple," he said. "You don't need to rely on technology or psychic abilities to predict the movements of your opponents. The key is understanding the patterns of human behavior, the way they think, and adjusting to that." Ysera blinked in surprise. The rest of the class was quiet for a moment, trying to process what he said. Even Professor Vastar seemed impressed. "That's an interesting perspective, Ethan," the professor said, nodding slowly. "A unique approach." Yazara felt a pang of irritation. How could he have come up with something so insightful? She was sure she had the best understanding of tactics in the room, but Ethan had just proven her wrong. As the class continued, Yazara found herself studying Ethan more closely. He wasn't like the other students. He didn't have the speed, the powers, or the enhanced senses that they all had. But there was something about him that made her uneasy. It wasn't his intellect or his calm demeanor. It was the fact that, despite being just a human, he always seemed different. Yazara shook her head, trying to push the thought away. He was still just a human, right? But as the lesson ended and she walked out of the classroom, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Ethan than she had ever imagined. The next day, Yazara couldn't stop thinking about Ethan. How had he managed to offer such a clever answer? It bothered her. After all, humans were supposed to be inferior in every way, weren't they? She had never met one who could keep up with her and her classmates. And yet, Ethan had shown an unexpected depth of understanding. Yazara's mind raced with questions. Was he hiding something? Did he know more than he let on? She had to find out, to prove once and for all that humans were no different from the others in the galaxy, weak and helpless. She needed to put him to the test. That afternoon, during their break, Yazara approached Ethan as he sat alone under the shade of a tree, reading a book. He looked up and smiled, that same calm expression on his face, which only made Yazara more frustrated. "Ethan," she said, her tone sharp but controlled, "I think it's time we had a proper challenge." Ethan raised an eyebrow, but didn't speak right away. Yazara took a seat next to him, her eyes glinting with determination. "I'm giving you a chance," she continued. "I'll compete with you in 3 tests: intelligence, strength, and combat. If you can beat me in any of them, I'll admit that humans are more than just ordinary." Ethan closed his book slowly, studying her carefully. "You want to challenge me?" he asked, his voice steady. Yazara nodded, not hiding the confidence in her smile. "Of course, I'm certain I'll win. You humans are known for being physically weak and lacking any real ability." Ethan didn't react to her harsh words. He simply looked at her and said, "All right, I accept. But I should warn you, I don't fight the way others do. I think about things differently." Yazara couldn't help but laugh. "Thinking differently, that's your secret weapon." She stood up, clearly amused. "This is going to be easy." The first test was intelligence. They were taken to a holographic simulation room, where they would each have to solve an intricate series of puzzles. Yazara had solved similar problems countless times in the past, so she was confident this would be no different. As soon as the test began, she immediately focused, her mind racing through the complex equations and logical steps. She breezed through the first few challenges without breaking a sweat, her eyes constantly flicking over the puzzles with ease. But when she glanced over at Ethan, she saw something strange. He wasn't rushing through the puzzles. Instead, he was studying each one carefully, taking his time. At first, Yazara thought this would cost him, but to her surprise, as the test neared its end, Ethan finished with a calm smile. The screen showed that they both had solved the puzzles in the same amount of time. Yazara's brow furrowed in disbelief. "How did you?" she began, but she stopped herself. Ethan simply shrugged. "Sometimes it's not about rushing. It's about thinking through every detail." Yazara could feel her confidence starting to shake. This was just the first test, and already he was proving to be more than she thought. Next, they moved on to the strength test. They were taken to the Academy's training hall, a vast room filled with various weightlifting machines and combat rings. Yazara was sure this was where she would crush him. She was faster, stronger, and could easily lift more than any human. But to her surprise, Ethan didn't seem concerned. Instead, he stepped up to a training machine that measured strength, the kind that required raw power. Yazara, eager to prove herself, stepped forward first. She pulled the heavy weights with ease, setting a record that she was sure no one would beat. Then Ethan took his turn. His movements were slow and deliberate. He didn't try to lift the maximum amount of weight in one go like she did. Instead, he focused on each movement, every push and every pull with precision. When the test ended, Ethan's result wasn't far behind hers, just a little less. But what baffled Izara was that he hadn't relied on brute force. It had been his steady and calculated approach that made him come so close. "You didn't try to overpower it," Izara said, confused. "You just paced yourself." Ethan smiled and shrugged. Sometimes, strength isn't just about power. It's about understanding your own limits and working with them. The final test was combat. The academy had a simulation room where students could fight virtual opponents to test their skills. Izara was ready. This was her area. The simulation would pit her against a series of increasingly difficult opponents, and she had no doubt she could defeat them all with her lightning-fast reflexes and flawless strategy. Ethan, however, had requested a simple hand-to-hand combat simulation. At first, Izara was amused. He would never win against her in this arena. But as soon as the fight began, she realized just how wrong she was. Ethan's movements weren't fast, but they were precise. Every strike he made was measured, and every defense was perfectly timed. It wasn't that he was stronger or faster than her. It was that he seemed to predict her every move. Izara found herself struggling to land even a single blow. Ethan's calm and calculated style allowed him to keep up with her in ways that completely baffled her. When the simulation ended, Izara was out of breath, her mind racing. She had lost again. "Not bad, huh?" Ethan said with a smile, wiping the sweat from his brow. Izara was silent for a long moment. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. She had expected to win, to prove her superiority. Instead, Ethan had shown her that there was more to him than just being human. It was clear now. Ethan wasn't ordinary. Far from it. The next few days at the Galactic Academy felt different for Izara. Her usual confidence had been shaken. She couldn't stop thinking about Ethan and the way he had outsmarted her in every test. It wasn't just his intelligence or strength that bothered her. It was the way he thought. He saw the world in a completely different way from everyone else. Izara tried to focus on her lessons, but her mind kept drifting back to that final combat simulation. She had always been the best, the fastest, the most powerful. But Ethan had proved that there was more to winning than speed or power. It was about strategy, timing, and thinking ahead. He had outwitted her in a way she never expected from a human. On the 5th day after the tests, Izara found herself sitting alone in the Academy's garden, staring at the twin suns setting over the horizon. The soft colors of the sky reminded her of the peaceful days back home on Orolith. It was a beautiful place, where everything was in harmony, where strength and intelligence were enough to make someone powerful. But now, she was beginning to question everything she had ever believed. "Izara," a voice interrupted her thoughts. She turned to see Ethan standing nearby, holding a small tablet. He had been quiet since their last encounter, and she hadn't expected him to approach her now. "You're thinking too hard," he said, offering her the tablet. Izara raised an eyebrow. "What is this?" "It's a simulation I created," Ethan said, his tone light. "I thought it might help you understand how my mind works." Izara hesitated for a moment before taking the tablet. It was unlike any simulation she had seen before. The interface was simple, but there was something about it that intrigued her. She tapped a few buttons, and the screen came to life. The simulation showed a series of scenarios, each more complex than the last. It was a mix of combat, strategy, and logic puzzles, but they were all interconnected. Ethan had created something that forced the player to think in layers, to solve one problem while anticipating the next. It was unlike anything Izara had ever encountered. She watched as the first scenario began. It was a combat simulation, but there was a twist. The player didn't just have to fight. They had to anticipate their opponent's moves, predict their next action, and plan several steps ahead. Izara quickly realized that it was more than just brute strength. It was about understanding the situation, reading the opponent's body language, and thinking several moves ahead. As the simulation continued, Yuzara struggled. It wasn't the physical challenge that bothered her. It was the mental complexity. She wasn't used to having to think so deeply about every choice. In the academy, speed and power were enough to win. But Ethan's simulation forced her to slow down and plan. For the first time in a long while, Yuzara felt challenged in a way that made her uncomfortable. After several attempts, Yuzara finally completed the simulation. But it wasn't easy. She set the tablet down, her mind still racing from the experience. "I don't understand," she admitted, looking up at Ethan. "This isn't like any simulation I've seen. It's not just about winning. It's about understanding the whole picture." Ethan nodded. "Exactly. I wanted to show you that there's more to fighting, and to life, than what we see on the surface. Sometimes it's about understanding the bigger picture, the underlying patterns." Yuzara frowned, deep in thought. "But this isn't how we're taught in the academy. We're trained to be the fastest, the strongest. We're taught to rely on our abilities, our enhancements. This is different." Ethan smiled gently. "It's all about perspective. You have your strengths, Yuzara. But sometimes what makes someone truly powerful is their ability to think, to adapt. The human way is not about being the best at everything. It's about using what you have in the best way possible." Yuzara stood up, still processing his words. She had never considered this before. She had always believed that strength and speed were the only ways to measure someone's worth. But Ethan was showing her that there was another path, a different way to think about power. "I don't know if I fully understand yet," Yuzara said slowly, "but I'm willing to try. Maybe there's something I can learn from you." Ethan's smile grew wider. "That's all I'm asking for. An open mind." As Yuzara left the garden, her mind was full of new thoughts. She had always believed that she was superior, that her abilities made her the best. But now she was beginning to see that maybe there was more to strength than she had ever realized. Ethan, the human who had once seemed so ordinary to her, was opening her eyes to a whole new way of thinking. It wasn't just about speed or power. It was about understanding, adapting, and using your mind to solve problems in ways no one expected. And for the first time, Yuzara was beginning to question everything she thought she knew. The days following Ethan's challenge passed slowly for Yuzara. She couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Her thoughts about humans, and about Ethan in particular, were starting to shift. He had shown her that there was more to being strong and capable than just physical power. There was something about his quiet confidence and ability to think ahead that intrigued her. At first, Yuzara tried to ignore it. She told herself that Ethan was just one exception, a strange human who had figured out how to trick the system. But the more she thought about their conversations and the lessons she had learned from him, the more she realized she couldn't simply dismiss it. Ethan wasn't like the others. The next week, during one of their lessons, Yuzara noticed that the instructor was teaching a new technique, one that focused not just on speed or strength, but on using the environment to your advantage. Yuzara had always relied on her natural abilities, her speed, and her enhanced strength. But as she watched the demonstration, she remembered the simulation Ethan had shown her, the one where thinking ahead was just as important as reacting in the moment. Maybe, just maybe, there was something to this idea of strategy. After the class, Yuzara found herself searching for Ethan. She knew she needed to talk to him, to learn more. She spotted him in the courtyard, sitting by himself, as usual, reading one of the many books he always carried with him. She approached him quietly, unsure of how to start. But as soon as he saw her, he smiled, that same calm, easy smile that made Yuzara's heart race a little faster than she was comfortable with. "Yuzara," he said, "you look like you've got something on your mind." Yuzara hesitated for a moment before sitting down next to him. "I've been thinking," she said slowly, "about what you showed me. The simulation and the way you think. I want to learn more. I want to know how you do it." Ethan looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "You want to learn how to think strategically, don't you?" Ysara nodded. "Yes, I want to understand how to use my mind, not just my body." Ethan closed the book in his hands and gave her his full attention. "All right. It's not easy, but I can show you a few things. The first rule is simple. Always look at the bigger picture." He leaned back against the stone wall and began explaining. "In every situation, there are always multiple options, but the key is to figure out which one will give you the best result. Sometimes it's about making sacrifices or letting the opponent think they're winning. That way, you can get what you really want." Ysara listened carefully, absorbing every word. It was hard to break free from the way she had been trained, to think beyond speed and strength. But Ethan made it sound so natural, so possible. The conversation continued late into the evening, and for the first time, Ysara found herself looking at Ethan not as a human to be tested, but as a partner in learning. There was something in the way he spoke, in the way he thought, that made her want to push herself beyond her limits. She realized that she had been holding herself back by only relying on what came easily to her. The next day, Ysara approached her training with a different mindset. As she sparred with her classmates, she remembered Ethan's words. Instead of charging in with all her speed, she took her time, watching her opponent closely, studying their movements. She allowed herself to think several steps ahead. And for the first time, she felt something shift in her, a sense of control she had never experienced before. Later that day, Ysara met Ethan for their usual break. This time, she was eager to share her experience. "I did it," she said, her voice filled with excitement. "I used what you taught me in the sparring match. I wasn't the fastest or the strongest, but I still won." Ethan smiled at her, a look of genuine pride on his face. "I knew you could do it." Ysara's heart fluttered. It wasn't just the fact that she had won. It was the way Ethan looked at her, as though he truly believed in her potential. For the first time in a long while, Ysara felt like she was truly learning something valuable, something that wasn't about being the best at everything, but about growing and improving in ways she hadn't imagined. The days passed, and Ysara's training became more focused, more deliberate. She no longer relied only on her physical gifts, but on her ability to think, to plan, and to adapt. And as her skills grew, so did her respect for Ethan. One evening, as the two of them walked together through the quiet garden, Ysara spoke again. "I never thought I could learn from a human," she said quietly, looking up at the stars. "But you've shown me that there's so much more to strength than I ever realized." Ethan looked at her, his expression soft. "We all have things to teach each other, Ysara. Strength isn't just about how fast you are or how much you can lift. It's about learning from those around you and being open to new ideas." Ysara smiled to herself. For the first time, she didn't feel the need to prove anything. She was learning, growing, and it felt like the beginning of something much bigger than herself. And maybe, just maybe, she was starting to see Ethan in a whole new light. The days following their conversation were full of change for Ysara. Her training had transformed in ways she never expected. Where she once relied on raw speed and physical power, she now focused on strategy and patience. And though it wasn't easy, she found herself growing stronger in ways she hadn't imagined before. Ethan's presence had become more than just a source of knowledge for her. It was starting to feel like something deeper. They spent hours together in the academy's quiet spaces, talking about tactics, strategies, and even their cultures. For every lesson Ethan shared, Ysara shared her own experiences from Orolith, stories of her people, their customs, and the way her world had shaped her into who she was today. Despite their differences, Ysara found that they had a lot in common. Both of them had been raised with a strong sense of purpose, with expectations placed on them by their families and societies. But now, both were questioning what it meant to be truly strong. One evening, after another long day of training, Ysara sat by herself on the balcony of the academy. The twin suns had just set, leaving a soft orange glow on the horizon. She was lost in thought, thinking about how much had changed in such a short time. Ysara. She turned to find Ethan standing just behind her. He had this quiet way of appearing out of nowhere, always so calm and observant. "What's on your mind?" he asked gently, his tone filled with curiosity. Ysara hesitated before speaking. "I've been thinking about everything. About what you've taught me, about the way I used to think. It's just hard to let go of old habits, you know." Ethan sat down beside her, his presence comforting. "I understand. It's not easy to change how you see the world, especially when everything you've been taught tells you to do it a certain way." Ysara nodded. "I've always been taught that strength is the most important thing. Speed, power, those were the keys to everything. But now, I'm starting to think there's more to it. And I don't know if I can completely let go of that belief." Ethan smiled softly. "You don't have to let go of everything. What you've learned has value, but it's about balance. It's not about abandoning your strength. It's about using it in the right way." Ysara looked at him, surprised by his words. "You make it sound so simple." "It's not easy," he admitted. "But it is simple. Strength comes in many forms, Ysara. There's physical strength, but there's also mental strength, emotional strength. You've got to find your own balance." Ysara thought about that for a long time, letting it sink in. She had always measured her worth by her physical abilities, but now she was beginning to see that maybe she could be stronger in other ways too. As the days passed, their bond grew stronger. Ysara found herself seeking Ethan out more and more. Whether it was for another lesson or just to talk, she felt a sense of peace when he was around. He had a way of making her feel understood, even when she didn't have the right words to explain herself. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult training session, Ysara sat down beside Ethan again, this time on the grassy lawn of the academy. She was exhausted, but there was a sense of accomplishment in her heart. "I think I'm starting to get it," she said, her voice quiet. "I'm starting to understand that strength doesn't have to be about being the best or the fastest. It's about knowing when to fight and when to step back. It's about using your mind as much as your body." Ethan looked at her with pride in his eyes. "Exactly. You're getting it." Ysara smiled, a sense of warmth spreading through her. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. The lessons from Ethan had helped her see herself differently, but more than that, they had helped her see the world in a new light. They sat there in silence for a few moments, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees around them. Ysara felt a sense of peace that she hadn't known in years. "You know," she said after a while, "I used to think humans were, well, kind of insignificant. I thought you were just weak, like all the other species we've encountered. But now, I see how wrong I was." Ethan chuckled, but there was no trace of anger or offense in his voice. "Humans aren't perfect, but we have our strengths. We're adaptable, we're resilient, and we care about things more than just winning or power." Ysara looked at him, her eyes softening. "You've shown me that." Ethan met her gaze, and for the first time, Ysara realized that their connection went beyond just teacher and student. There was something deeper between them, something unspoken that neither of them had addressed yet. But for now, Ysara was content. She had learned more than she ever thought possible, not just about strength, but about herself, about Ethan, and about the world around her. And she was beginning to understand that sometimes the greatest strength lay in the ability to change, to grow, and to open yourself to new possibilities. As the weeks went on, Ysara and Ethan's relationship continued to grow. They spent more time together, not just in training, but in conversation as well. Ysara had never imagined that a human could become someone she trusted, but that's exactly what Ethan had become. His ideas, his calm manner, and his dedication to learning had opened her eyes to a new world. She was no longer the person who only relied on her speed and strength. Now she was someone who was learning to think, to observe, and to adapt. One day, as the two of them sat together on the academy's balcony, Ysara looked out over the landscape. The view was breathtaking. The vast expanse of the academy's grounds stretched out in front of them, with towering trees and distant hills. But Ysara wasn't paying attention to the view. She was lost in her thoughts. "What are you thinking about?" Ethan asked, noticing her silence. Ysara hesitated before speaking. "I'm thinking about the final challenge," she said quietly. "It's only a few weeks away, and I'm not sure I'm ready." Ethan turned to look at her. "The final challenge. The one where you have to prove everything you've learned." Ysara nodded. "Yes. I've been training for years, but this is different. It's not just about skill anymore. It's about how you handle every part of yourself. Your mind, your body, and your emotions." Ethan smiled gently. "You've come so far already, Ysara. You're stronger than you think." Ysara shook her head. "You don't understand. Everyone expects me to win, to be the best. But I don't know if I can." Ethan leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "You've already won, Ysara. Winning the final challenge doesn't mean you're the best at everything. It means you've learned the most, grown the most, and become the best version of yourself. I believe in you." Ysara felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. Ethan's belief in her was something she hadn't experienced before. She had always been taught that strength came from within, but now she was beginning to understand that it wasn't just about what you could do. It was about who you were becoming along the way. That evening, as the sky turned dark, the academy hosted a gathering. Students, instructors, and various leaders from different species came together to discuss their progress and share their experiences. Ysara sat with Ethan, watching as other students proudly talked about their achievements. But as the conversation turned to the final challenge, she began to feel the pressure building within her. She could see the nervousness in some of her peers. They, too, felt the weight of expectation. The final challenge wasn't just about skill. It was about proving you could overcome every obstacle, both physical and mental. It was about showing that you were ready for whatever came next. As the night wore on, Ysara found herself walking alone in the quiet gardens. She needed to clear her head, to focus. The pressure was building, but she wasn't sure how to release it. She had always prided herself on being in control, on being the strongest. But this challenge was different. It wasn't just about strength anymore. It was about balance. "Ysara." She turned and saw Ethan standing at the edge of the garden, his figure illuminated by the soft glow of the nearby lanterns. He had been following her. "I'm fine," Ysara said quickly, trying to hide her uncertainty. Ethan raised an eyebrow, but didn't press her. He simply walked over and stood beside her, staring out at the stars. "You know," he said quietly, "I never thought I'd see the day when a warrior like you would question herself." Ysara chuckled softly, the tension easing slightly. "I guess you don't know me as well as you think." "I know you better than you think," Ethan replied with a grin. "But I understand. This challenge, it's not just about you. It's about all of us. About what we've learned, what we've overcome. And sometimes the hardest part is realizing that we don't have to do it alone." Ysara looked at him, surprised by his words. "What do you mean?" Ethan shrugged. "I mean that no matter what happens in the challenge, you're not doing it just for yourself. You're doing it for everyone who believes in you, for everyone who's been part of your journey. You've already learned so much. But the most important thing you can learn now is that it's okay to rely on others too." Ysara felt a small smile tug at her lips. She had always thought she had to do everything on her own. But Ethan's words were slowly breaking down that belief. Maybe she didn't have to carry the weight of the challenge alone. Maybe, just maybe, she could rely on the people around her. As the evening drew to a close, Ysara felt a sense of calm she hadn't expected. The pressure was still there, but it wasn't as overwhelming. She had a purpose now, not just to win, but to show herself and others that she could adapt, grow, and trust in the journey. The final challenge was still ahead of her, but for the first time, she didn't feel as though she had to prove everything. She was learning, growing, And most importantly, she was no longer facing it alone. The day of the final challenge had arrived. The entire academy was buzzing with excitement, and the air felt electric with anticipation. Zara stood at the entrance of the arena, her heart pounding in her chest. She had trained for this moment for years, but now that it was finally here, she wasn't sure if she was ready. Ethan stood beside her, offering a reassuring smile. "You've got this, Ysara. Just remember everything you've learned." Ysara nodded but felt a knot in her stomach. She had prepared for every possible test: strength, endurance, strategy. But this was different. This challenge would test everything: her skills, her resolve, and her ability to remain calm under pressure. As they entered the arena, the hush fell over the crowd. All eyes were on them, the final group of students who had made it to this point. The instructors stood in their elevated positions, watching closely. Among them were representatives from various species across the galaxy, those who had high expectations for the competitors. Ysara felt the weight of their gaze, but focused on the task ahead. She had to block everything else out. She had to remember the lessons she had learned, to rely on her mind, her body, and the strength of her heart. The challenge began with a series of physical obstacles: high walls, narrow platforms, and difficult terrain. Ysara moved with speed and precision, her training kicking in. Every jump, every twist of her body felt effortless as she navigated the obstacles. She remembered what Ethan had said about trusting herself, and for the first time she felt it: the confidence to move without hesitation. She reached the final obstacle, a large, complex puzzle that required both logic and strategy to solve. Her first instinct was to try and solve it quickly, using her speed. But then she remembered what Ethan had taught her. It wasn't always about racing to the finish. Sometimes the best strategy was to think carefully, to assess the situation before acting. She knelt beside the puzzle, carefully studying the arrangement of pieces. Each piece was different, and each had to fit into place in a specific order. It wasn't easy, but she felt her mind sharpening, her focus narrowing. The pressure of the crowd faded away as she concentrated on the task at hand. Minutes passed, but Ysara didn't rush. She placed the final piece into the puzzle, and a soft click echoed in the arena. The crowd erupted in cheers as the puzzle locked into place, signaling the completion of the challenge. Ysara stood up, breathless but triumphant. She had done it. She had completed the final challenge, not by being the fastest or the strongest, but by being the most balanced, the most thoughtful, and the most determined. Ethan was there in an instant, his face filled with pride. "You did it," he exclaimed. Ysara smiled, feeling a sense of relief wash over her. "We did it," she corrected, thinking of all the people who had supported her along the way, especially Ethan. She wouldn't have been able to make it this far without him. As the ceremony concluded, Ysara stood alongside the other competitors, waiting for the results. The instructors took their time, carefully reviewing each student's performance. Ysara felt nervous, but she reminded herself that this wasn't about the title or the accolades. It was about her personal growth, her journey, and the person she had become along the way. When the results were finally announced, Ysara was surprised to hear her name called. She had placed first. It wasn't just her physical prowess or her ability to solve the puzzle that had impressed the instructors. It was her growth, her ability to overcome her doubts, and her strength of character. Ysara stepped forward to accept her reward, but it wasn't the trophy she focused on. It was the realization that she had achieved something far more important. She had learned to trust herself, to rely on others, and to believe in the journey, no matter how uncertain it might seem. As she stood there, holding the trophy in her hands, Ysara looked over at Ethan. He was smiling, his pride evident in his eyes. She realized that for the first time in her life, she had found something even more valuable than victory: true friendship. "I couldn't have done it without you," Ysara said, her voice filled with gratitude. Ethan smiled warmly. "You did it, Ysara. All I did was remind you of what you were capable of." Yizara nodded, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. The challenge was over, but her journey had only just begun. She had learned that there was always more to discover about herself and the world around her. And no matter where her path would lead, she would face it with the confidence that she could overcome anything. As the crowd continued to cheer, Yizara knew one thing for certain. She was no longer the person who doubted herself. She was someone who believed in her abilities, trusted her instincts, and most importantly, knew that she could always count on the people who cared about her. With Ethan by her side, and the future ahead of her, Yizara knew she was ready for whatever came next.